Hi, I'm Angelo Kanicki, and in this video, what I'm going to talk about is the integrative framework of OB, which is an essential component in our book. And the integrative framework is used for two purposes. Its first purpose is to help students organize the many theories and concepts that they will learn about in this product. The integrative framework shows up in every chapter, at the start of a chapter and the end of a chapter. So I will explain how the framework was created and how it's used in the book to help students organize. I will also briefly explain how the integrative framework is used for its second purpose, which is really to help the students apply our three-stop problem-solving approach. So let me begin by talking about how the integrative framework was created. And what Mel and I thought about was, what can we give students that will enable them to put all the many concepts into simple boxes? So what we went to is systems theory. And as you know from a classic system, as you can see from the slide, systems have inputs, processes, and outcomes. All systems have that. And if you think about OB concepts, they can fit into the boxes of input, process, and outcomes. Now, the second thing we need to do is to make the input box a little more clear, or break it into subcategories. And for that, we relied on Lewin's theory. Very powerful theory, very elegant theory. And it very simply says behavior, all behavior is a function of person factors and environment factors. So that gives us two buckets, as you can see on the slide, for the inputs, person factors and environmental factors. So as the students are reading in different chapters, they'll be able to know what they're reading and how it relates to the inputs of the person factors and the environmental factors. Now, the next thing that we needed to do to help students organize what they're learning is to focus on the processes and the outcomes in terms of levels. Now, as you know, in organizational behavior, we study individual level processes and outcomes, group level processes and outcomes, and organizational level. So as you can see on the slide, the next way of segregating the integrative framework is to put individual, group, and organizational level within the process box and within the outcome box. All right, now on the slide you can see the basic structure of the integrative framework. It's got inputs, processes, and outcomes. Inputs are segregated into person and environmental characteristics factors. Processes are at the individual, group, and organizational level, as are outcomes. Now, how does that framework get used in every chapter? What I'd like to do is use chapter 2 as an illustration. The integrative framework shows up at the very start of every chapter. And what we do at the start of the chapter is we populate the framework with the key concepts that are going to be contained in that particular chapter. So if you look at the slide, what you can see is at the opening of chapter 2, on the inputs, we have two personal factors. We have your values and your personal attitudes. Those are two main OB concepts that are discussed in chapter 2. In the process box, you see that there's nothing there. That's because there are no processes talked about in chapter 2. Finally, in the outcome box, you see that we have workplace attitudes. So workplace attitudes are a major concept talked about in chapter 2. So by looking at the slide and what the student would see at the beginning of chapter 2, that student knows that we're going to talk about three major things in this chapter: values, personal attitudes, and work attitudes. So at the start of the chapter, the integrative framework tells the student this is what's coming. Now at the end of the chapter, the integrative framework shows up again. And here's where it's very valuable for organizing everything in the chapter, as well as a starting point for our three-stop problem-solving approach. Now, at the end of the chapter, before I show you the fully populated integrative framework, what I want you to know is how we use the framework relative to a chapter summary. At the end of our chapter, we don't have a traditional chapter summary. We call it, "What Did I Learn?" It's really quite cool. What did I learn? It's summarizing for the student what they should have learned by reading this chapter. And the first thing in that end of chapter, what did I learn section, is a high-level summary of what was learned in the chapter. The next thing that's in there is a detailed key point summary for every major section in the chapter. That's the second component. The third component in this section, what did I learn, is the fully populated integrative framework for that chapter. And I'm going to show that to you in just one moment. And the last part in the what did I learn is the major questions that were used to set up each section in the chapter. So there's 4 components in the what did I learn. The one that's critical for doing problem solving is the fully populated integrated framework. Here we're going to put it up on the slide, and you can see now that in this fully populated integrated framework, if I look at the inputs, it repeats what was in the opening integrated framework, and that is it tells the students you learned about values and you learned about personal attitudes. You can see from the slide that there's nothing in the process box, once again telling the student you didn't study or learn anything about processes. But look at the output box. If you can see the fully populated matrix on the screen, you can see that Chapter 2 talked about quite a few outcomes that are very important. And you can see it talked about task performance. Task performance is a very important outcome in organizational behavior. It also, in this chapter, we talked about workplace attitudes. We talked about another concept called well-being and flourishing. Without question, personal factors like values and attitudes impact our well-being and our flourishing. Another outcome talked about in this chapter is what is called organizational citizenship behavior, OCB. We talked about that as well as counterproductive work behavior. And then the final individual level outcome talked about in this chapter, as you can see on the slide, is turnover. Employee turnover is costly, and work attitudes are related to employee turnover. Job satisfaction is positively related to turnover, and students learned about that. So all they need to do is look at this matrix at the end of the chapter, and they can see that employee turnover is an important outcome when we talk about work attitudes and job satisfaction. From the slide, you can also see there were no group level outcomes discussed, and you can also see that at the organizational level, students learned that the work attitudes of employees are related to financial performance. That's not a surprise. We all know that the work attitudes of employees relate to financial performance. Students learn that. And the final outcome variable shown in the integrative framework is customer satisfaction. Again, I think is something that makes a lot of sense. The attitudes of the employees, the satisfaction of the employees affects the satisfaction of the customers. Why? Because satisfied, happy employees tend to provide better service. So as you can see, the integrative framework that's summarized at the end of this chapter, it's telling the student, these are all the things that were covered, these are all the things that you learned about. Now, let me go back to where I started. The integrative framework is used for 2 purposes. To organize what you learned, and again, if you look at the slide, you can see the integrative framework at the end of the chapter summarizes everything that you've learned. It's a great way for the students to know what was important and what I should be learning. The second use of the integrated framework is to apply it for problem solving. And that's where we're going to go to now. Because at the end of every chapter, we have a problem-solving application case. And this case, for every chapter, is a real company, real people that have real problems to solve. And the students are going to use the integrative framework, shown at the end of every chapter, to solve the problem in the case. So the integrative framework at the end becomes the starting point to do problem solving. So there's the setup. The students are now ready to solve the problem, and in the next video we will talk about how to use the integrative framework that's up on the screen to solve a particular problem.